Is she here? Is she in the city?
No, we were upstate, so she's coming back later today. She's with my parents. So it's a first one.
Oh, we got take a long time.
It's a good thing, right?
All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Erica Wood. Before we begin the program, I'd like to let you know that books by the authors in this program can be purchased from Books on Call, New York City, right downstairs, just outside the entrance to the building. And immediately following this program, authors will be signing their books at that location. So that is not to be missed right after the program. My name is Erica Wood. I'm an associate professor of law at New York Law School, one of the other law schools in New York, where I also direct the Voting Rights and Civic Participation Project. I want to thank everybody for coming today and thank the Brooklyn Book Festival for organizing this tremendous event, and certainly thank my fellow panelists here. So today's topic of voting rights from Reconstruction to Obama, while broad, is incredibly timely. I believe that we are at the most critical moment for voting rights in our country since the Civil Rights Movement 50 years ago. And what has led us to this point? Why are we here where everything seems to be happening all at once? Well, I would propose that there are three related events that bring us to this point. First is the 2008 election, which renewed attention to the power of the vote in our country. The second, related to that, is the result of that election, which gave us our first African-American president in the White House. And third is an enormously important Supreme Court opinion that came down last year called Shelder County versus Holder, where for the first time the Supreme Court actually failed to protect the right to vote in our society, a right that the Supreme Court just 50 years ago had called preservative of all other basic political and civil rights. So these three related events just in the last few years have brought our country to a really critical moment about the right to vote and what it means in our society. What does that mean? So since 2010, new voting restrictions have been enacted in 22 states in our country. That means nearly half the country, voters in nearly half the country, will face new voting restrictions this year for the first time. Race is certainly a factor in this. Of the 11 states with the highest African-American turnout in 2008, 7 have new restrictions. Of the 12 states with the largest Hispanic population growth, 9 passed laws making it harder to vote. And nearly 2/3, or 9 out of 15, of the states previously covered by the Voting Rights Act because of past voting discrimination have passed recent restrictions on voting rights in the last couple of years. In addition, 6 million Americans are disenfranchised because of a criminal conviction in their past. Black Americans are 4 times more likely to lose their right to vote as a result of these laws. 1 out of 13 African Americans have lost the right to vote as a result of a criminal conviction. In 3 states, Kentucky, Florida, Virginia, they disenfranchise nearly a quarter of their African American population. In total, 2.2 million African American citizens have lost the right to vote because of a criminal conviction in their past. And of course, this is not the first time that our country has experienced widespread efforts to deny citizens of color of their most fundamental right. So today, we are going to talk about the history of voting rights in our country, how what is happening today both reflects that history and signifies perhaps a new chapter, and what the future might hold. And we're going to do all that in 50 minutes. So let's get started. So I want to introduce my fabulous panelists here. Joining us to my far left, Professor Michael Higginbotham is the Wilson H. Elkins Professor of Law at the University of Baltimore and the author of Race Law, Cases, Commentary, and Questions, and the book he'll be signing today, Ghosts of Jim Crow, Ending Racism in Post-Racial America. To his right is Ari Berman, a contributing writer for The Nation and an investigative journalism fellow at the Nation Institute. He's the author of Herding Donkeys, the Fight to Rebuild the Democratic Party in Reshape American Politics, and he's working on a new book about the history of voting rights since 1965, which I personally am waiting for with bated breath. Okay, to my left is Darryl Pinckney, a longtime contributor to the New York Review of Books and the author of several books, including High Cotton, Out There, Mavericks of Black Literature, and Blackballed, The Black Vote and U.S. Democracy, which he'll also be signing after the panel today. So let's get to it. Michael, in your book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, you reflect on the history that I've mentioned earlier, and you identify what you call a complex racial paradigm and a, quote, vicious cycle of white superiority and black inferiority that continues to this day. Could you explain how you see this paradigm, or these, as you call them, ghosts of Jim Crow, reflected in the recent efforts to restrict voting rights in our country?
Sure. I appreciate the question, and thanks everyone for coming out today. The title of the panel here, From Reconstruction to Obama, I think is really a title that gives the appropriate focus. So often at panels like this and events like this, we start with the civil rights movement. And I think that's a huge mistake, because what's going on today in terms of the paradigm that I identify, the separation, the victimization, and the discrimination, what's going on today is very reflective of what transpired to end Reconstruction and what occurred to create and maintain Jim Crow practices. So, for example, the very restrictive voter ID laws, the limitations on early voting and same-day registration, the racial gerrymandering that occurs in voting districts. These are practices that are very reflective of things that went on to end Reconstruction and to maintain Jim Crow. For example, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes. While we can argue about whether the intent today is the same, and that's arguable, but clearly the impact, the effect in terms of reducing the contribution and the participation in the voting process of elderly people, of young people, but most significantly of racial minorities is there. It's real, and I don't think it can be disputed. Clearly, President Obama has an amazing personal story. I think, in 2008, we recognized the monumental development that was. And I think his personal story, being biracial, being raised by a single mother and then assisted in terms of being raised by his grandparents. It's an incredible story that he wasn't supposed to make it in America, let alone to go to Harvard, let alone to be president of the Law Review, and clearly to make it to the White House. That was not supposed to happen. But personal story aside, it reflects progress, that racial minorities have an opportunity, more opportunities to participate today. But make no mistake, progress does not mean post-racial. Progress does not mean that race is no longer significant in terms of opportunities afforded or hardships endured in our society. And that's what my book talks about, the progress we've made, but also how much further we need to go.
Thank you. Ari, Congress responded to the widespread disenfranchisement of African Americans during the Jim Crow years with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which has been reauthorized, I think, 5 times by Congress, with overwhelming majorities in both houses. Can you tell us a little bit about the Voting Rights Act, how it came to be and what its impact has been, and also about the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County that really gutted that legislation?
Sure, absolutely. Can everyone hear me? Great. So basically, it's a fascinating story. The 15th Amendment is passed in 1870. It's supposed to give people the right to vote free of racial discrimination. And then basically, after the end of Reconstruction, for 95 years, there's this gap between the 15th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act, which essentially is just a piece of legislation to enforce, after almost 100 years, the 15th Amendment. And so what the Voting Rights Act did is it looked at a problem of racial discrimination in the southern states. And basically what you had is only about 30% of African Americans were registered to vote in the southern states in 1964. There had been a Civil Rights Act passed in 1957, a Civil Rights Act passed in 1960, and a Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, none of which came even close to solving the problem of widespread voter disenfranchisement in the South. In states like Mississippi, for example, 7% of African Americans were registered to vote in 1964. And so the Voting Rights Act, the most important thing it did was it abolished the literacy tests and then gave the Attorney General the authority to file legislation to ban poll taxes as well, the kind of two main things that had disenfranchised African-American voters and then also other voters as well, Hispanic voters, other language minorities in addition. And so one of the most ingenious things that was done in the Voting Rights Act is the people that drafted the Voting Rights Act, the people in the Johnson administration, the people in the civil rights movement that were pushing it, they knew where the problem was. They knew the problem was in places like Mississippi,